when the most powerful rooms in the world go quiet. My name is Kevin Price, and when the 7 most powerful economic nations on the planet call an emergency meeting, the right response is not panic. But it is also not indifference. It is attention. Focused, clear, informed attention. Because emergency meetings at that level do not happen without a reason. And the reason, whatever its specific details, always has financial consequences that eventually reach ordinary investors in ways they rarely see coming until the impact is already being felt. Let me take you back to a specific moment in my own financial journey that shaped how I respond to events like this. Early in my investing life, I had developed what I thought was a sophisticated relationship with global news. I consumed financial headlines constantly. I tracked market reactions. I watched every press conference and policy announcement with what I believed was careful attention. And yet, despite all of that consumption, despite all of that apparent awareness, I consistently missed the actual significance of what I was watching. I was absorbing information without understanding it. I was tracking events without connecting them to the deeper financial forces they represented. There was one particular moment when a major coordinated policy announcement came out of an international summit. The kind of announcement that uses careful, measured language designed to project calm and control. And I remember reading it and thinking, well, that sounds reassuring, and moving on with my day. 3 months later, I was looking at my portfolio wondering what had happened. The announcement I had read so casually had been a signal. A clear, structural signal about the direction of interest rates, currency policy, and market liquidity. And I had missed it entirely because I was reading the surface of the words rather than the substance underneath them. That experience taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my financial life. The words that come out of rooms like a G7 emergency meeting are almost never the most important thing. The most important thing is why the meeting was called in the first place. What problem was urgent enough to bring together the finance ministers and central bank governors of the world's largest economies outside of their regular scheduled gatherings? Because scheduled meetings produce scheduled language. Emergency meetings produce emergency language. And emergency language, however carefully crafted to project stability, is always a window into a financial system that is under more stress than it wants to publicly admit. So let us think carefully about what a G7 emergency meeting actually means. The G7, for those who want a clear definition, is the group of 7 major advanced economies whose collective financial decisions shape the conditions of the global financial system for everyone. When their leaders gather in a normal scheduled setting, the agenda is broad, the discussions are measured, and the outcomes are largely telegraphed in advance through diplomatic channels. But when they gather in an emergency setting, the agenda is narrow and urgent. Something specific is happening that requires immediate, coordinated response. And the need for coordination itself tells you something critical. It tells you that whatever is happening is large enough and interconnected enough that no single nation can address it alone. Markets in trouble. That is the second half of our title. And I want to be precise about what that phrase means in the context of a G7 emergency response. Markets do not get in trouble because of a single bad day or a temporary volatility spike. Those things happen regularly, and they resolve without requiring the coordination of the world's most powerful economic institutions. Markets get in serious trouble when the underlying mechanisms that keep them functioning, the liquidity, the confidence, the orderly transmission of monetary policy, begin to break down in ways that threaten to become self-reinforcing. When selling begets more selling, when credit tightens faster than policy can respond, when the confidence that underpins the valuation of entire asset classes begins to fracture in ways that are visible to sophisticated participants even before they become visible in the headlines. That is the environment in which G7 emergency meetings get called, and that is the environment that every investor, regardless of their portfolio size or sophistication, needs to understand how to navigate. Not with panic, not with reckless repositioning driven by fear, but with the kind of clear, grounded, historically informed thinking that allows you to see what is actually happening beneath the surface of the official narrative and make deliberate, intelligent decisions about what it means for your financial position. Over the course of this video, we are going to do exactly that. We are going to examine what G7 emergency coordination actually means in practical financial terms, and what historical precedents tell us about the outcomes. We are going to look at the specific market vulnerabilities that make this kind of coordinated response necessary, and what they reveal about the true condition of the global financial system. We are going to talk about the common mistakes investors make when major institutional events like this create uncertainty and volatility. We are going to build a practical framework for thinking about your own financial position in a world where the most powerful economic institutions are in emergency mode. And we are going to close with a warning that I believe every investor needs to hear clearly and honestly before the next phase of this situation unfolds. This is going to be a serious conversation, one that treats you as an intelligent adult who deserves honest information delivered with clarity and respect, rather than fear and hyperbole. The world's most powerful financial institutions are in emergency mode. That fact deserves your attention. And this video is designed to make sure that attention translates into understanding rather than anxiety. Stay with me, because what we cover in the next part is where the real substance of this situation begins to come into focus. Breaking. G7 Emergency Meeting. Markets in Trouble. Part 2 of 5. What emergency coordination actually means for your money. There is a pattern that runs through every major G7 emergency coordination in modern financial history. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. The pattern is this. By the time the emergency meeting is announced publicly, the problem that triggered it has already been developing for months. The announcement is never the beginning of the crisis. It is the moment when the crisis became too large to manage quietly behind closed doors. This matters enormously for how you interpret what is happening right now, because the natural human response to a breaking news headline about an emergency meeting is to treat it as the starting point. To think that the danger begins now, with the announcement, and that the period before the announcement was safe. But that thinking is exactly backwards. The period before the announcement is when the risk was building. The announcement is simply when the rest of the world was invited to see what the insiders already knew. Let me explain the mechanics of how this works in practical terms. The finance ministers and central bank governors who sit around the G7 table have access to data, to internal financial system monitoring, and to private communications between institutions that the public never sees. They know about stress in the banking system before it appears in headlines. They know about liquidity problems in credit markets before those problems become visible in public trading data. They know about currency pressures and debt market dislocations weeks or months before ordinary investors feel their effects. When those insiders decide that a situation requires emergency coordination rather than the usual behind-the-scenes management, it means they have assessed the problem as too large, too fast-moving, or too interconnected to handle through normal channels. And that assessment, made by the people with the most complete picture of the financial system's true condition, is itself the most important signal available to any investor paying attention. Now let us talk about what coordinated G7 response actually looks like in practice, and what it means for markets and for ordinary investors. Coordination at this level typically involves several simultaneous actions. Central banks align their policy signals to prevent currency dislocations from amplifying market stress. Finance ministers coordinate fiscal messaging to prevent confidence from deteriorating further. Liquidity facilities are activated or expanded to ensure that credit markets continue to function even as risk appetite contracts. And carefully crafted public statements are released, designed to project confidence and stability while the actual work of addressing the underlying problem happens away from public view. Each of these actions has direct financial consequences. When central banks align policy signals simultaneously, interest rate expectations shift across multiple major currencies at once. That shift ripples through bond markets, currency markets, and equity markets in ways that can be both rapid and significant. When liquidity facilities are expanded, the cost and availability of credit changes in ways that affect everything from corporate borrowing to mortgage rates to the valuation of assets that depend on cheap financing to justify their current prices. And here is the critical insight that most investors miss entirely. These coordinated actions are not neutral. They do not simply stabilize the situation and return it to exactly where it was before the stress emerged. They resolve the immediate crisis by creating new conditions, conditions that redistribute financial risk rather than eliminate it, conditions that protect some assets and expose others in ways that depend entirely on what specific tools the coordination deploys. The investors who understand this dynamic are not the ones who react to the announcement with either panic or relief. They are the ones who ask the right question immediately. Not, what does this emergency meeting mean for the market tomorrow? But what new financial conditions will the response to this emergency create over the next 1 to 3 years? And how do those new conditions affect the real value of what I currently own? That question, asked seriously and answered honestly, is what separates the investors who navigate these moments successfully from the ones who either panic out of positions at exactly the wrong time or stay complacently in positions that the changing conditions are quietly making more dangerous. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. When major coordinated interventions have been deployed in past financial stress events, one of the most consistent outcomes has been an expansion of money supply and a suppression of interest rates below their natural market levels. In the short term, this stabilizes confidence and prevents the immediate crisis from becoming a catastrophic collapse. But over the medium to long term, it creates an environment of financial repression, where the real return on cash and conventional fixed income assets is negative, where inflation quietly erodes the purchasing power of everything denominated in the currencies being managed, and where the assets that benefit most are the ones that exist outside the direct control of the coordinating institutions. Hard assets, commodities, real productive businesses with genuine pricing power, and monetary metals. This is not speculation. This is the documented historical outcome of coordinated institutional intervention in financial stress scenarios. And it is the framework that should be shaping how every thoughtful investor is thinking about their portfolio positioning right now, as this particular emergency situation unfolds. The meeting has been called. The coordination is happening. The question is not whether this will have financial consequences for ordinary investors. It will. The question is whether you understand those consequences clearly enough to make intelligent decisions about how to position yourself before the full impact becomes visible in the prices of the assets you hold. That understanding is what we are building together in this video. And in the next part, we are going to look at the specific market vulnerabilities that made this emergency meeting necessary. Because understanding the problem is the foundation of understanding the solution. The vulnerabilities that made this meeting necessary. Emergency meetings do not happen in healthy systems. They happen when something that was supposed to hold together quietly starts coming apart. And right now, there are 3 specific vulnerabilities in the global financial system that together explain why coordination at the highest level has become necessary. The first vulnerability is debt. The combined government debt of the G7 nations has reached levels that would have been considered catastrophic by the economic standards of any previous generation. Debt that was accumulated through successive crises, each one addressed by borrowing more, each solution planting the seed of the next problem. At these levels, debt stops being a manageable policy tool and starts being a structural constraint. Every interest rate decision, every inflation response, every fiscal choice is now made in the shadow of obligations so large that the cost of servicing them competes directly with every other priority a government has. That constraint, felt simultaneously across multiple major economies, creates the kind of systemic fragility that turns manageable problems into emergencies. The second vulnerability is the bond market. Government bonds are supposed to be the safest, most stable assets in the financial system. They are the foundation on which everything else is priced. When bond markets become volatile, when yields move sharply and unpredictably, the repricing does not stay contained in the bond market. It transmits immediately into mortgage rates, corporate borrowing costs, equity valuations, and the balance sheets of every financial institution that holds bonds as a core asset. A stressed bond market is not one problem. It is every problem simultaneously. The third vulnerability is currency credibility. When multiple major currencies are under pressure at the same time, the coordinating mechanism that normally allows one strong currency to anchor the system while others adjust breaks down. There is no clean anchor. Every central bank is managing the same impossible tension between fighting inflation and supporting growth. And that simultaneous stress across multiple reserve currencies creates the kind of disorderly conditions that require exactly the coordinated response a G7 emergency meeting is designed to provide. These three vulnerabilities did not appear overnight. They were built over years. The emergency meeting is simply the moment when their combined weight became impossible to manage through normal channels alone. What smart investors do when institutions go into emergency mode. When the most powerful financial institutions in the world enter emergency mode, the worst thing you can do is mirror their urgency with your own. Because institutional emergency response and individual investor emergency response produce completely opposite outcomes. Institutions coordinate, stabilize, and strategically reposition. Individual investors panic, sell at the wrong time, and lock in losses that the eventual stabilization would have recovered. So let us talk about what the right response actually looks like from where you are sitting. The first thing you do is nothing reactive, nothing driven by the headline itself. The announcement of an emergency meeting is not the moment to restructure your portfolio. It is the moment to think clearly, to assess what you already own and whether it is positioned for the conditions that the emergency response is likely to create. Reactive selling in moments of institutional stress is one of the most reliably wealth-destroying behaviors in all of investing. The investors who panic out of positions during coordinated institutional interventions almost always sell at or near the temporary bottom and miss the stabilization that follows. The second thing is to assess your real vulnerabilities honestly. Not your emotional vulnerabilities, your structural ones. Look at your portfolio and ask which positions are most exposed to the specific conditions this situation is creating. Assets with high debt dependency are vulnerable when credit tightens. Long-duration bonds are vulnerable when inflation expectations rise. Highly valued growth assets are vulnerable when liquidity contracts. Understanding your actual exposure to these specific risks gives you the clarity to make deliberate adjustments rather than emotional ones. The third thing is to think about what the coordinated response will likely create over the medium term. As we discussed in the previous part, institutional coordination at this scale almost always involves expanding liquidity and managing interest rates in ways that suppress real returns on conventional assets. That environment historically favors hard assets, commodities, monetary metals, and productive real assets with genuine pricing power. Not because they are exciting, because they are structurally positioned to benefit from the conditions that the response creates rather than the conditions that preceded it. The fourth thing is to maintain liquidity. In periods of genuine financial system stress, cash has a role that it does not have in normal conditions. Not as a long-term holding, because in an inflationary environment, cash loses purchasing power consistently, but as a tactical reserve that gives you the ability to act when genuine opportunities present themselves, rather than being forced to sell existing positions to raise funds at the worst possible moment. Maintaining some dry powder in a stress environment is not fear, it is optionality. And the fifth thing, perhaps the most important of all, is to zoom out. Emergency meetings feel urgent because they are framed urgently. But the financial consequences of what is being addressed and what response is being coordinated play out over months and years, not days and weeks. The investors who respond to that longer timeline, rather than the short-term noise, are the ones who make decisions they can be proud of when they look back from a calmer moment. Stay calm, assess honestly, position deliberately, and give the situation the time horizon it actually operates on. The final warning and the decision that cannot wait. We have covered serious ground together today. We started by understanding what an emergency meeting at the G7 level actually signals, and why the announcement is never the beginning of the problem. We examined the mechanics of coordinated institutional response and what it historically creates for ordinary investors. We identified the 3 specific vulnerabilities that made this emergency necessary, and we built a practical framework for responding intelligently rather than reactively. Now I want to close with the honest, direct warning that this entire conversation has been building toward. The financial system is not broken, but it is bent further than it has been at almost any point in modern history. And the emergency coordination happening right now is not a sign that the people in charge have everything under control. It is a sign that the weight of accumulated imbalances, the debt, the currency stress, the bond market fragility, has reached a point where it requires the simultaneous attention of every major economic power on the planet just to prevent it from tipping into something far more serious. That is not a normal condition, and responding to it as though it were, staying complacently positioned in assets that made sense in a different financial environment, trusting that the system will simply absorb whatever stress comes next, the way it has absorbed stress before, that response carries a level of risk that I do not believe most ordinary investors fully appreciate. Here is what history tells us with uncomfortable clarity. Every major coordinated institutional intervention in financial history has bought time. It has prevented immediate collapse and created a window of apparent stability. But it has never eliminated the underlying imbalances that made the intervention necessary. It has deferred them, redistributed them, and in many cases amplified them by adding more debt and more liquidity to a system that was already strained by too much of both. The window of apparent stability that follows emergency coordination is not a signal that the danger has passed. It is an opportunity. An opportunity to think clearly while the noise is temporarily reduced. An opportunity to assess your real financial position honestly. An opportunity to make the deliberate, informed adjustments that the urgency of the crisis moment makes difficult, but the relative calm of the stabilization period makes possible. Do not waste that window. Do not look at the stabilization that follows emergency coordination and conclude that your original financial position requires no adjustment. Do not allow the relief of avoided immediate crisis to override the clear evidence that the structural conditions driving that crisis are still present and still building. The specific adjustments that make sense depend on your individual situation, your time horizon, your existing exposure, your liquidity needs, your risk tolerance. What is universal is the need to make those assessments deliberately and honestly, rather than defaulting to inertia because the immediate danger appears to have been managed. Reduce your exposure to the assets most vulnerable to the conditions the response creates. Build your allocation to assets that hold real value independent of paper currency stability. Maintain liquidity that gives you options rather than forcing you into reactive decisions. And approach the months ahead with the kind of patient, informed attention that this moment genuinely demands. The G7 meeting has been called. The markets are under stress. The coordination is underway. These are not abstract geopolitical events happening in rooms far removed from your financial life. They are direct, structural forces that will shape the value of what you own, the cost of what you borrow, and the purchasing power of what you save over the months and years ahead. You now have the framework to understand those forces clearly. The question is what you choose to do with that understanding. And that choice, made now, while the window of relative calm is open, may be one of the most important financial decisions of this entire decade. I am Kevin Price, and before we close today, I want to ask you genuinely and directly for one simple thing. If this conversation gave you real clarity about something that matters deeply to your financial future, please take 1 second right now and hit that like button. Not as a courtesy, but as a signal that this kind of honest, serious, no-hype financial education deserves to reach every investor who needs it right now. Because there are people watching headlines about emergency meetings and feeling confused and frightened without the framework to understand what they mean. Your like helps this video find them. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do that right now and turn on the notification bell. Every video on this channel is built on the same commitment. Real financial education for real investors who want to understand what is actually happening in the world and what it means for their money. No sensationalism, no shortcuts, no empty promises. Just clear, honest thinking, delivered with respect for your intelligence and your time. And please, drop your thoughts and your questions in the comments section below. Tell me what part of this conversation hit closest to home for you. Tell me what questions it raised that you want to explore further. Tell me what you are thinking about doing with your own financial position in light of everything we discussed today. I read every comment. I respond personally. And this community, the conversation that happens between us in those comments, is one of the most valuable things we are building here together. The meeting has been called. The window is open. Use it wisely. This is Kevin Price. Stay informed, stay calm, stay positioned, and I will see you in the next video.